Do you need to connect something or?
No, I'm just talking.
Okay, perfect. So this is our week on surveillance. We'll have Mia running the seminar, but we have an amazing guest, one of the authors of one of the essays we read this week, Rayne Fisher-Quann. So this week we read Foucault, Discipline and Punish, Achille Mbebe, Necropolitics, Shoshana Zuboff, about surveillance, and the Feminist Panopticon by Rayne. And she's graciously accepted to come and present some of the work. So with no further ado, please.
Well, I'm so honored. I'm like honored to be included in that list. That's like really crazy. Thank you. And thank you so much for having me. And yeah, I'm super excited to talk about this. And it was really, I wrote this essay when I was like 20 maybe, or like 19, like a while ago.
Oh, do you want to give a quick introduction as to who you are and
Yes.
Yeah, that would be helpful, I think.
Yeah, my name is Rayne. I'm a writer. I write essays primarily. I have a blog called Internet Princess, which is where that essay was published. I primarily write I write a lot about womanhood, and I write a lot about identity and self-commodification of performance. And I specifically really like to write about the ways that identity is sort of constructed and imposed by the internet. And my writing used to be a lot more online because I used to be a lot more online. So this essay that you guys read was I was like rereading it, and I haven't read it in a year probably. And I was like, oh man, I was like really on TikTok. Like, and I remember like that was like sort of deep pandemic. And I was just like so on TikTok, which is like not an app that I'm really on that much anymore. And I remember like, first of all, just seeing these sort of systems of surveillance play out like again and again and again, like the type of content, I don't know if any of you guys are really on TikTok, but the type of content that tends to do super, super well on TikTok is this sort of content that plays with almost like non-consensual surveillance. Like almost every other day I would see like a viral post, and you still see viral posts of people like recording strangers at a cafe being like, if your name's Sarah and you work at TJ Maxx, your friends are talking shit about you, and I recorded them. And those videos get like millions of views, and people really like have this sort of, I was so fascinated by it, have this sort of like gleeful, there's this kind of gleeful relishing in these sort of non-consensual peeks into other people's lives, and this feeling, I think, especially that you have control over these people's lives, or that you can impact the sort of direction that things go. That like by blowing up this video about Sarah's friends who work at TJ Maxx and who are talking shit about her, that you can kind of affect the course of Sarah's life, and maybe nebulously that you can like do some good, that you can like save Sarah from these people. And especially a year ago, about a year and a half ago, I think, when this West Elm Caleb thing happened, I'm not sure if you guys were really familiar with it at the time, but I remember that just one day, my entire TikTok feed was full of these like New York City dating influencers, which is a genre of influencer that also does very well on the internet. If you guys aren't familiar, where kind of their whole job is like going on dates. And it's kind of crazy. Like one of them, I recently saw one of her videos where she said she's gone on 1,000 dates in the last 3 years, which is actually insane if you think about it. And this is a side note, but I always kind of wonder like what they do if they really like someone, because the whole kind of premise of their content is that they do like a get ready with me before I go on this date, and then they come back from the date and they're like, this was the guy, this is what was cool about him, this is what was weird about him, this is whether or not he's hot. And again, people love this content. It's their job, I think, is sort of to build this, to perform this sort of simulation of what people who aren't from New York imagine that New York would be like, in sort of a Sex and the City way, or just who are from a big city imagine a big city would be like. And this content does very, very well. And one day I remember watching this play out live, and I remember that there was this really fascinating sort of exhilaration in it, where a lot of these New York City dating influencers started sort of realizing that they had been dating the same guy. And his name was Caleb, and he worked for West Elm. And they sort of just stumbled upon it, like across each other's content, and started connecting the dots. And in a series, this was all public, in a series of public videos that were racking up like millions and millions of views, you could watch these women realize in real time that they had all been dating the same guy. And there was sort of like a laundry list of like things that he had done that were like, you know, bad form. Like, I think he had slept with one of them, and then he had left her house and gone on a coffee date with another one of them, and then slept with her. And he like was really into them on the apps, and then he would ghost them. Like, it was just kind of like, he's maybe not that great of a guy. And like I wrote in the essay, he also did send unsolicited naked pictures of himself to some of these girls, allegedly, which is like very genuinely very bad, like that's very misogynistic, it's ostensibly violent. But as I wrote in the essay, like in a really fascinating way, that was kind of the only allegation that wasn't really getting talked about. I think maybe precisely because it wasn't so fun. Like there were sort of hours of discourse dedicated to like his love bombing, but the discussion of, you know, this ostensibly sexually predatory behavior was only really brought out like once somebody would be like, hey, do you think this is maybe like going a little bit too far? Like, do you think, like, I remember I never engaged with any of these videos, and I started getting videos on my For You page with pictures of him and his mom at his high school graduation. Like, people like found his full name, found his Hinge account, obviously found his workplace and tried to get him fired, like found his family. And sometimes people would be like, hey, like, he seems like he sucks, but like, is this maybe going a little bit too far? And that's when people would be like, no, like, he's a predator. This is feminist praxis. And I thought that was really interesting. And it also made me feel sort of sick in my stomach a little bit, because that justification was used not only to justify the choices of individuals who were engaging in this surveillance, but also to justify the corporations that were immediately started profiting off of this sort of like moment in the zeitgeist, like really immediately, because this was the biggest thing on the internet. You would see these like dating apps and like mayonnaise companies and clothing brands start producing ads about West Elm Caleb. Like, dating apps would be like, you won't find a West Elm Caleb on our website, which again I found to be very sickening and very sort of dark and disgusting, especially when this story was, again, ostensibly being presented at times as a story of abuse. But people were so gleefully like eating up all of this content. And I thought it was really interesting how this sort of specter of feminism was being used to justify this spectacle, this kind of surveillance capitalist spectacle. And I started calling that in my head the Feminist Panopticon, which I think can sort of interchangeably be called surveillance feminism. And as I sort of thought about it more and have continued to kind of observe this phenomenon happening over the last 2 years, I feel like it can be kind of two things. And on the one hand, I think that the Feminist Panopticon can be almost a genuine belief that feminists can find material liberation through participating in surveillance and in kind of ritualistic punishment. And then I also think that there's maybe more insidiously this other kind of surveillance feminism, or another kind of feminist panopticon, wherein feminism is used as this kind of like after the fact justification, or just progressive ideas in general. Progressivism in general is used as this after the fact justification for what is clearly like kind of a libidinal engagement in spectacle as entertainment, or as surveillance as entertainment. And I think often these two ideas can overlap with like varying degrees of cognitive dissonance. Like, I think very frequently you'll see people who are obviously clearly start out just really wanting to gleefully engage in this kind of entertainment, this surveillance entertainment, and they end up genuinely convincing themselves that they're participating in feminist praxis by doing this. And then I think you also see people who start off legitimately wanting to engage in feminist practice, and they end up getting caught up in this sort of exciting entertainment spectacle. And I think a big part of why I think the feminist angle, or the sort of leftist angle to this whole thing, is so interesting, because obviously everybody everywhere engages in spectacle as entertainment. Like, everybody on social media is sort of obsessed with replicating this kind of surveillance. I think what's really interesting is that the tech world, particularly I think in the early 2010s when it was starting to become really ubiquitous, really offered surveillance as empowerment. Like it kind of said, you can express yourself here, you can put yourself onto this platform, like obviously in a classical surveillance capitalism way, they were like, you can turn your personhood into a set of data points that we will commodify and profit off of. But this is the public square. This is like, Twitter loves to say like, this is the modern public square where the cream will rise to the top in the marketplace of ideas. And you maybe can't be heard in the real world. Maybe nobody cares about your opinion in the real world, but people care about your opinion here. And through commodifying yourself, through submitting yourself to surveillance, which is what we do when we go on social media. And I say that, in a morally neutral way, that's just what you do when you go on social media. That's how you can find a modicum of empowerment. And I think that this is an idea that was maybe especially sort of tantalizing to like feminists and queer people and people of color, because obviously like we and they are all denied justice or denied feeling heard or feeling represented or denied power often in our material lives. So I think it was something that was marketed very cleverly and very effectively when we're denied self-expression and empowerment in other areas. And of course, like the Panopticon is a prison system. It's a system of justice and punishment. And I think particularly for feminists, I think there is this very interesting sort of enticing idea of, we are denied justice so constantly in the real world. We're denied justice, or I should say in like the offline world. We're denied justice so constantly in like the literal prison system. I mean, not that it provides justice for anybody, but feminists often feel so materially disempowered by the way that justice operates in the real world. And I think, when tech corporations offered us an alternate way of serving and enforcing justice and punishment, I think a lot of feminists or a lot of people who consider themselves feminists found that to be very enticing and found it to offer, a very real form of catharsis, and a form of catharsis that I think meant something real to a lot of people. But obviously our engagement with the system, number one, like explicitly generates profit for tech corporations that exist to generate profit for them. Every interaction that we have that is mediated on a social media platform is both, automatically generating profit, but also is sort of optimized. Like, we're encouraged to optimize those interactions to maximize profit for these tech companies. And number two are those engagements are also limited by their parameters. And I think therefore will never be like truly liberating. Like tech CEOs, I think obviously don't have like radical feminist liberation in mind for anybody, and I think would never allow it to truly exist on their platform. And I think you can see that in the way that censorship is applied. You can see it, I think, just sort of materially in the fact that so little real material feminist change has come from the millions and millions of engagements that have come out of all of these platforms. And then number three, all of our engagement with this system exists in a culture of spectacle that, is basically like kind of biohacking our brains to seek entertainment and to seek constant stimulation and to constantly seek like higher and higher stakes. And I find this all, I think, obviously to be very troubling. And I think I found it to be obviously I'm a woman that talks about feminism on the internet. So if I were to say that it's like, totally useless to talk about feminism on the internet, I guess I'd have to like kill myself or something, or find another job maybe. But I think it's something that I realized that I had to be like extremely explicitly aware of, is the limits of feminist expression on the internet. And something that I've been thinking about recently is that like tech surveillance capitalism, this thing that forces you to be aware of the self, that like, literally makes the self into an object to be consumed. It makes your individualized personhood into like a valuable commodity. I think it makes feminists into something like gig workers, like it makes us self-conscious, it makes us aware of the self, it forces the sort of individualized, or it incentivizes the production of this sort of individualized selfhood on the internet, that I think pushes people to engage with feminism in this very individualistic way. I think the most prominent, like, quote unquote feminist influencers of the 80s, for instance, were like typically people who were very active in like prominent feminist organizing groups or in the feminist academic tradition. There were really no like hyper individualized feminists who were prominent in feminist thought in decades forward, prior to this, as far as I know. But now really the primary way that I think a lot of popular feminist thinkers engage with feminism is in these sort of individualized bursts that are rewarded immediately and individually in a gig economy way, in the same way that like individualized bursts of labor are rewarded individually in the literal gig economy. And you can be rewarded monetarily or through likes and clicks. It sort of created this kind of freelance feminism, where people engage with feminism in individualistic ways in like vertical videos or in infographics or in blog posts. Versus, I think, obviously the alternative to that would be like finding fulfillment and liberation through feminist organizing and through like building collective power. But I think just as capitalism created the gig economy and made it harder to build sustained labor power, surveillance capitalism also sort of gigified the intellectual or the organizing sphere and made it harder to build sustained organizing power. So like in the intellectual gig economy, the only way for individuals, or we feel, I think, that the only way for individuals to find empowerment or political catharsis is through individualized surveillance and, like engagement with the master's tools, which like famously cannot dismantle the master's house. And it obviously, all of this really reminds me of like Society of the Spectacle, where Debord says that passive identification with the spectacle supplants genuine activity. And I think that that's something that I feel in myself like all the time. Like I think you can feel like you're watching these videos where like one guy, like one kind of shitty guy that reminds you of all the shitty guys that you've ever known, is getting just like, ruthlessly torn apart by millions of people. And you watch that and you're participating in this spectacle, either actively by commenting or by making videos or whatever, or just by observing it. And I think for a lot of people, you kind of feel like, you don't really need to go to that organizing meeting anymore. Like you're given that feeling of catharsis. You're given that feeling of like feminist girl power or whatever, that I think ends up kind of sublimating the desire to engage in legitimate feminist praxis. I think also notably, we feel completely disempowered to affect structural change. Like we aren't connected to our communities by and large when we're totally engulfed in surveillance capitalism. We tend to feel like intense nihilism and despair about these like wide-ranging structural issues that make womanhood genuinely like very, very painful. And I wrote about this in the essay, is that like when there was sort of a backlash to the West Elm Caleb situation, there were a lot of people who were like, yeah, this is crazy because he didn't really do anything wrong. And I think that's not quite right. Like, I think a key to understanding this for me was the fact that like there are literally millions of women who feel so constantly disempowered by like the dating landscape and by the way that heterosexual dynamics constantly play out again and again and again, that make women feel devalued and have this sort of pervasive feeling that we're objects, or that we're meaningless, or that we're worthless, or that we mean nothing to these men that we ostensibly want to care for. And I think that is part of why the West Elm Caleb thing took off in the way that it did, is because a lot of women feel very disempowered to affect meaningless or meaningful structural change to heterosexual dynamics, to the way that love or interpersonal relationships function under the patriarchy. So we kind of, the only thing that is made available to us, and the thing that is made very, very available to us by tech surveillance capitalism, is finding individuals like West Elm Caleb and making them into like lightning rods for our genuinely justified anger and pain. But these actions don't actually change anything really materially. They're just catharsis machines. And they also, again, do end up generating quite a bit of profit not only for TikTok and Twitter or whatever, but for the many corporations that end up capitalizing on this cultural moment. And again, like all of this, I think really obviously reminds me of like Walter Benjamin when he says that like fascism sees its salvation in giving these masses not their right, but instead a chance to express themselves. Like I think people are given so constantly the chance to express themselves. Like again, that's the fundamental promise of social media, is that you can express yourself by submitting to surveillance. You can express yourself, and that if you can express yourself enough, I think a lot of people again do feel enough catharsis from that they're sort of they stop so hungrily seeking a chance to gain material rights. But then I think there's like, again, so that's the first facet of the Feminist Panopticon, I think, is this sort of collective delusion that we can reach feminist liberation through engagement in the spectacle. But then there is also this other facet that I think is a lot more insidious, which is that I think people on the internet are desperate for stimuli, and I think they crave the entertainment that tech surveillance provides, and I think they crave a kind of entertainment that isn't traditionally or readily available anymore. Like I think, I think, and I again feel this in myself, it's like part of the reason why I felt like I had to get off TikTok is because I totally started to feel that like itch in your gut for like real entertainment that pans out in real time, and you see the updates and you see these videos as they're happening, and you can be the first comment and you can get thousands of likes on your comment, and it feels like the best reality show in the world. It kind of is the best reality show in the world. Like, as somebody who loves reality TV, the original West Elm Caleb spectacle, you literally couldn't plan that. Like, it was really, really good fucking television. And The Bachelor isn't good anymore because everybody on the show is like so accustomed to surveillance and have primed their lives for it, and understand that they're going on the show to participate in surveillance, that it's too obviously a simulation of itself now. And that's the case with like all reality TV. Like that's what everybody says about Love Island, it's what everybody says about The Bachelor, is that it doesn't feel high stakes and it doesn't feel real because people have actually become too accustomed to surveillance. They're too able, I think, to effectively perform within it. So the public, I think, has moved on to making real people, at best, like semi-consensual participants in sort of a live reality show that the audience feels like they have control over. Like there's, I think, just like this huge rush in being able to manipulate like real people's lives. And of course, I think as surveyed objects, as you know, we all are, as the consumer, the audience is, as surveyed objects, I think we're sort of aggressively self-conscious. You know, we're made morally self-conscious. We're made so aware of the self that I think there's this unique element of moral self-consciousness. And so I think we feel the need to justify this obviously self-indulgent and sort of amoral form of entertainment to ourselves and others. And so we see feminist or leftist or pro-justice narratives used to reframe this engagement with spectacle as like a moral imperative. And we see this happen all the time with everything, with West Elm Caleb and with like, I haven't talked about Couch Guy yet. I don't feel like I have time to go into Couch Guy, but that was another like viral TikTok moment, even bigger than West Elm Caleb maybe, where like this girl filmed herself surprising her boyfriend at university. And she like, it was like a live video of her like opening the door to surprise her boyfriend. And he was sitting on the couch with two girls. Maybe some of you saw this happen. And then, it seems ridiculous, but it literally was like a multi-month constant news cycle of people breaking down every second of this girl's clip to like speculate on whether or not her boyfriend was cheating on her. And for both of these people, it effectively like ruined their lives. Like they said, like everybody on campus knew who they were. It was national news, international news. And it was obviously like a horrible invasion of privacy, and obviously really, again, like a libidinal and gleeful engagement with like what people presumed must be this like tension or this real pain in this relationship. But you would see people framing it as like, you know, we want to help this girl. Like we got to look out for a sister. It was really framed in this sort of feminist girl power way that it obviously wasn't. And in the essay I wrote, you know, for the consumer, the problem with this, of course, is an ethical one. Nobody wants to feel like a bad person, and so cultural Puritanism collides with this phenomenon to alleviate any subconscious guilt, and perhaps more importantly, provide a never-ending lineup of targets. If we can only convince ourselves that these people deserve it because of their wrongdoings, we can sprinkle the ecstasy of the moral high ground on top of the dopamine rush of consumption. So that is an element that was really interesting to me also, was sort of like after the fact moral justification to the engagement in the spectacle. And something recently, on my blog, I wrote very extensively about the Amber Heard trial, which obviously was, I think one of the largest eruptions of cultural misogyny in modern history. And again, a really, really unique live public spectacle. Like, you would see people engaging with this excessive surveillance, like finding every clip of Amber Heard they could possibly find and breaking down every one of her body movements, every eye twitch, like every motion of her hair and her shoulders, and really just aggressively, universally surveying her and her relationship with Johnny Depp for entertainment, for pure entertainment. And hundreds of people made careers, made thousands, tens of thousands of dollars, and made careers off of their engagement in the surveillance of Amber Heard. And what I thought was very interesting, especially interesting about that whole thing, is that the far right wing and elements of people who would identify themselves as the left wing really came together in the interest of participating in a surveillance spectacle. This is from an essay that I wrote about Amber Heard, but it's facts, so I'm just gonna read it. The Daily Wire, Ben Shapiro's conservative news outlet, spent tens of thousands of dollars promoting biased anti-Heard propaganda. The right-wing connection to the trial is expansive and terrifying in its own right. On the subreddits that serve as home base for Depp's proponents, tens of thousands of relatively apolitical fans are abandoning mainstream media in favor of increasingly conservative pseudo-news sources that support their cause. Countless right-wing pundits and commentators have latched onto the pro-Depp movement as a gateway to new young audiences, and even the official GOP Twitter account posted in support of Depp's victory. It's not a stretch by any means to say that this trial has been adopted as a gold rush scenario for right-wing forces looking to gain cultural power. A popular article encourages the institutional right to copy Johnny Depp in order to defend and protect accused white nationalists. Notably, a coalition of abuse survivors, many of them self-identified feminists, wrote an open letter called "We Do Not Stand With You" to Amber Heard, obviously decrying her status as a victim. And feminists, again, self-described feminists, served as a very vocal part of the anti-Amber Heard. They were very anti-Amber Heard and very, very heavily engaged in the spectacle. There were feminist groups that came together to support Johnny Depp, that came together to be we support male victims of abuse as well. It was really absorbed as part of this pseudo-feminist cause. And it was the most obvious example I've ever seen of the right wing actively capitalizing on the public hunger for surveillance to drive centrist and even progressive leaning people towards the right. Because people who did identify as feminists or identified as center left or even further left, people that I knew and that I trusted and that I had worked with on political issues before, I saw them getting drawn into far right news sources because they had become so addicted to engaging in the surveillance spectacle of the takedown of Amber Heard for her horrible moral wrongdoing that they were just desperate for media that would continue to serve to fill that need for them. And so this was a really material example of the right wing capitalizing on the Feminist Panopticon and on the right wing using it as a way to build cultural power. And I think the end of the day, of all of this for me is that I think feminism should first of all mean more than a cheap sort of justification for engagement in an entertainment spectacle. But I also think that accepting tech surveillance as a materially liberating kind of feminist praxis, or taking these platforms at their word that they exist for our empowerment or our liberation or can serve us justice in any meaningful way, only serves to kneecap our movements, kneecap collective movements and kneecap feminism as a whole, and normalize a culture of mass surveillance and puritanical punishment that I think will inevitably only punish people who are already labeled deviant in society. So that is to say feminists and queer people and people of color. And I think it's very imperative that we resist it and not engage with it. And yeah. that's what I have to say about the Feminist Panopticon. I would love to talk about it or to do questions. I don't know, what do you
Yeah, thank you.
think?
This was very, very interesting, and you don't know this, but we actually had Debor like 2 or 3 weeks ago, and we also had Benjamin, so I think it's some good callbacks to some of the texts that we read this semester. I think one of the things that is interesting from your argument, which you anchor in like these two very recent events, is that we read Foucault and we understand the idea of the prisoner being secluded and being controlled by the panopticon and the structure enabling that control. But one thing that's made evident by our new technologies, and maybe Foucault could not really see this, or even Bentham himself, is that every prisoner secretly wishes they could inhabit the tower. Mm-hmm. And the behaviors you described in the essay sort of make that very clear, because this libidinal urge that we have to, oh, what is this person doing? Or this person is doing something real. Let me take a video and share it with my friends. Has this idea that like we, I don't know if we're just like gossips or snoops, but we just have this desire to engage in the same behaviors that technically are imposed on us. And so I'm curious if what your general thoughts were about the essay, if you have similar situations you've seen in your own circles or your own cultural spheres that resonate with that experience of people, of course, being surveilled, but also when given the opportunity to be in the tower, just also wanting to do the surveilling. Like, did you the two examples, was that something that like resonated with you or something that you'd seen before, events like that? Or I'll have the text real quick. First of all, had you heard of this? Because I know not a lot of you are on, some of you are not on TikTok, right? We did that thing when a lot of people here are not on TikTok. And so,
which is great, really. It's pretty awful.
And so you probably hadn't heard of West Elm Caleb, right? No. Have you ever seen something similar on Instagram where people are almost like in a true crime way trying to figure out what's happening in a situation in real time? No? Okay, then maybe it's not so common. I thought the reason why I wanted to bring the essay in is because this can feel like Foucault can feel, he's talking about the plague and he's talking about things that don't feel so current. And in many ways, you're like, okay, well, we have the prison, and so people have changed the schools a little bit, so school doesn't feel as much as a prison as it did maybe in the 60s or 50s, specifically with like new curricula and I think things like Montessori or things that are like less structured. But I think this is a great example in how we sometimes engage in sort of similar behaviors. What do you think when you were presented with the structure? Were there other things in society that you had a call back to or that you were reminded of?
Well, I think true crime is like
such a good additional example. It's not something that I really engage with or have ever engaged with, but it also is something that like really shockingly has like an audience, not just of millions, but like of tens of millions of people. Like all of the most popular podcasts on Spotify, they're all true crime podcasts. It's like a multi-million-dollar industry. And I feel like I've been so fascinated looking at that too, because it obviously is such a similar thing, like this desire to engage with like real people and real tragedy and to watch it and to be this like sort of observer, and then also of course to be like you can participate in it as well.
Do you remember those shows? Maybe like Dateline was like that as well.
Yeah.
Like before the whole podcast true crime, I feel like a lot of families in the United States on Friday nights at 8 p.m. on ABC, you'd watch, maybe 9 actually, you'd watch Dateline and you see these crimes and they're all real and it'd be like reenacted. And I don't know, that night was specifically for those kinds of shows, or A&E, like Dog the Bounty Hunter
And
for
I
48
just
hours.
24-hour news, like local news. Have you seen Nightcrawler?
No, but I think, did we talk about Nightcrawler? No, that's a movie where a person he's a video reporter for the news, and when crime starts to run dry, he starts to sort of foment it himself for it to happen. I think that one thing that is interesting to me also with this idea of the need for reality, right? We talked about Baudrillard last week, and we talked about how the real was escaping us. It's almost as if our desire to surveil others we're like clawing, trying to get more reality in, because so much of the world is just spectacular and it doesn't feel embodied and real. And so if we're able to get Caleb fired, that's like, well, that's real impact. That's like something that doesn't feel like it's just, the Kardashians we talked about were scripted, right? And I think we showed some clips of like wrestling. So you watch wrestling so much that you're like, oh, I kind of want something real. And maybe you start a fight club, right? And then this is the corollary or the example here.
Yeah, and I think really notably, like we're talking about Dateline or local cable news or whatever, like again, that feeling that people love of like watching real tragedy and real crime. All of those things have been so materially incorporated into surveillance capitalism, like the Ring doorbell. Like the Ring doorbell exists because of the popularity of local cable news, like which is like the doorbell that people install where you can like there's a camera outside of it and you can like survey your neighbors and you can see everybody.
Have you seen those the Ring doorbells?
These, the Ring doorbell has like literally worked with true crime. Like they advertise on true crime broadcasts and they advertise on local cable news, because when you get people first of all to be scared of like the world outside and to feel like they're constantly under threat and to feel like there's danger around every corner, but also when they have become obsessed with engaging with this kind of surveillance and with engaging with real violence and real pain and stuff like that. I think it also makes people weirdly much more willing to submit to surveillance as well, and it also makes them want to be like in the prison tower. Like it makes them want to be the person who's looking. So I think that's something that also is really fascinating, is how these like literal surveillance corporations, like the most literal surveillance corporations in the world.
I think Ring is owned by Amazon, right? So.
Yeah. It's super dark actually. It's
so
scary.
Another thing that's very interesting in this is that this idea of the Feminist Panopticon is, what we read was called discipline and punish. You surveil, you capture a misdeed, you punish, and then hopefully the discipline is the norm seeping through society. How effective are we as feminists or are feminists in doing the discipline part and going from the punishment to disseminating the norms in the same way that, like, he talks about the guillotine, right? The reason why the guillotine is a public thing is that you want to see the person getting murdered, like, I'm never going to do this again.
Mm-hmm.
And so similarly here on the public square, digitally, of course, this man, this Caleb or couch guy, is not getting guillotined, but is facing severe consequences for all to see. with the hopes, of course, that similar to the thief who gets their head cut off in front of everyone, no one will ever do that again. From your research and experience on the internet, how effective is that as a method?
I found it to be very ineffective. I mean, I think about this a lot in relation to like the Me Too movement, and this is something that I read about when I was writing about Amber Heard as well, is that something that I found fascinating about the Me Too movement, which was obviously this moment of like mass cultural catharsis. And you know, it felt like a real feminist movement, like it felt like a moment, and it materially was, like, you know, things changed socially. There was a backlash to the backlash that I think the Amber Heard trial was a huge part of. But the thing that I think is interesting, that I talk about with my female friends all the time, is that like nobody's having better sex. Like nobody actually feels safer. I don't think that most of the most powerful predators in the world are actually out of power. I don't think that sexual abuse is any less rampant in Hollywood. And I think that what ended up happening in sort of this weird, like twisted, almost twisted version of like the philosophy of discipline, is that we sort of ended up kind of taking these like sacrificial lambs, or maybe the institution put forward these sacrificial lambs, these like individual men or these individual wrongdoers, to be, you know, ritualistically punished or performatively removed from power or whatever. Almost so the rest of them could keep participating unscathed in these power dynamics and in these, you know, abuses of power. That's what I think was maybe the most material result of the Me Too movement, which is maybe kind of a controversial feminist opinion. But I mean, I don't know, and I think there also is something to the unreality of it. Like, I really don't think any guys watched the West Elm Caleb thing happen and were like, oh, I gotta be better to girls on Hinge. I think maybe they thought,
I gotta be more discreet.
I gotta be more discreet. I think maybe they thought I shouldn't match with any influencers, which, you know, like, which is really interesting, because maybe the takeaway for a lot of men was that they should seek out women with less power, or who have less, who are less empowered through surveillance. But yeah, I would have to think about it, but I don't know exactly why that is. Like,
because technically this should work,
yeah,
right?
technically this should work, but it really doesn't seem like it does.
Like, we have the framework, we have like the playbook and these sorts of methods. So we're not going to read him, but René Girard is a French thinker who has this idea of scapegoating. So socially, we find these causes, and he's very Christian, so to him, like, Jesus is a scapegoat, and you signal them out, and through the process of sacrificing of the scapegoat, you're able to sort of move on to the next sort of social problem, because you've exemplified what was wrong, and someone should not do this again, of course. And so there's this, you know, it calls it mimetic desire, when we're the same thing, but when we're unable to get it, we pick a scapegoat, we sacrifice them, and we solve the issue. But it's strange that it didn't really work here. And it's almost as if maybe the nature of surveillance changed, and maybe its aim and purposes changed. You know, a potential reading for us would be that instead of now being for discipline, because we work in tech and because we work for these companies, it's not for discipline, but now it's, what's that word, autotelic, it's just surveillance for surveillance sake, because the discipline part, the companies don't really care about. What they care about is to increase the, let's call the surface of surveillance. And that becomes the serving purpose of the punishment. Not the normative elements which we see in like the Plague Town, but rather very much just to increase how much you can surveil, because that's how these companies profit, or that's how they benefit from the structure. So maybe it's been hijacked. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to, well, I think one thing that it could come down to is the fundamental ineffectiveness of these platforms. Like the fact that, like, I think it's sort of a mirage or a delusion that we can engage in legitimate feminist praxis on like Elon Musk's Twitter or Elon Musk's X or whatever.
Like, you know, these platforms don't exist to change the society in an anti-patriarchal way. They're optimized to do the opposite. I mean, I think Elon Musk openly admitted, I think in 2020, that allowing a modicum of hate speech to remain on the platform is like necessary for profit margins, because that's what keeps people engaging. It's what like keeps people commenting and replying, and it makes them angry, and it ups their dopamine, and it ups their adrenaline, and it makes them want to come back. And I think maybe that is one of the fundamental differences, is that like the very DNA of these platforms, it's not a neutral place. Like it's a very explicitly political place. And sometimes I feel as though any you know, leftist political activity, or perhaps any political activity at all that happens on these platforms, is again sort of a spectacle, or sort of a performance that's removed from the real in a way.
So we have these three ideas when we talk about technology. Is the rejection. That's like the Unabomber, the Kaczynski method, where just like we shut it all down. We have the embrace, which some of the thinkers we saw, the manifesti, they sort of embrace the culture, or they accelerate. Where, in your opinion, does feminist praxis align itself in this mode of action? On the rejection of these platforms, going to more like analog grassroots, or the creation of their own social media platform that for some reason is designed in a way that eschews the current algorithms that push hate speech, or where do you situate it?
I feel torn about this often. I sometimes I can be kind of a Kaczynskiite, like in my head a little bit. Like sometimes I'm just like, everything here is so awful, and there's nothing here that's good. But I think that that's not quite true. Like I think there is something that is at least objectively very powerful at being able to reach like large numbers of people, and being able to connect with people emotionally, and being able to disseminate information on a scale that's wider than pretty much anything we've ever had the capacity to do before. I think the way that I've often like thought about it to myself is that like I think the internet is a really good conduit for information. I think the internet is like a really good like highway, I think, but I don't think the internet can be like the final destination. Like I think the internet maybe could be really good at introducing feminists to each other, again, at like disseminating ideas, but I think there always has to be something, or I hope that there can always be something that like brings people back towards the real, and brings people back to their communities, or encourages people to connect with their communities, or gives people the tools to effectively engage in community work, or to build. I think it would be very good to be able to build neutral community spaces on the internet that are like not run completely by algorithmic profit incentives, and are not owned by like tech oligarchs. And I do think that is possible too. But I do think that these spaces, like specifically Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, are too fundamentally, I mean, they're hyper capitalist institutions. And as such, I don't think can ever be like truly, I don't think liberation will be served to us by them. But what do you think?
The revolution will now be televised and now be TikTok.
Yeah. Revolution, like part 1 of 247.
Revolution with Subway Surfers behind. I mean, we talk about this, I think, quite frequently. We're always trying to figure out whether or not there is a means of subverting these platforms, right? We talked about the situationists and the idea of détournement, of like they were able to take ads which were all over town and reshape them and put a new message to these sort of advertising messages that were surrounding us in the city. And there may be, you know, that'll be the position that, you know, the board, like we can take these and subvert them and Trojan horse new ideas through these platforms and sort of take them down from the inside. I think we saw some works by like Alec Monopoly, like the new, or like Banksy, which kind of attempt to do the same thing, but kind of falls flat because it ends up being, you know, we saw that tent, right? It ends up being just a spectacle that people take photos of, and you see the homeless person or the homeless drawing, and you don't donate, you don't go volunteer the shelter. you're like, oh, I think this is Banksy, or you take a photo, you put it on Instagram, and you move on.
Yeah.
And I think this is interesting when you talk about the libidinal urge. The problem is that it can actually be discharged through the post. If the post was unsatisfactory, if the post didn't provide the catharsis, I think we would be pushed towards action.
Yeah.
But it's such a good medium that we actually feel that discharge. I think.
Yeah, they're really good at it.
Yeah.
They've gotten really good at it. And there's like, yeah, there's like the other DeBoer quote. I feel like I wrote it down here somewhere, but I didn't say it. Like, in societies where modern conditions of production prevail, all of life presents itself as an immense accumulation of spectacles, and everything that was directly lived has moved away into representation.
Yep.
And I think we can engage with these representations of things, and we can feel as though we feel like we're living, like we feel like we're participating, we feel like we're affecting change, because these representations are so good. Like they've gotten super good at making the representations.
I think in both of these stories, there are people who are thrown into the real. You know, we talked about this, Baudrillard talks about the World Trade Center, and my own retort is that, you know, America was thrown into the real in 2001 because you cannot avoid the reality of the ineffable violence of terrorism. And so we're like, okay, something incredible happens, and like we're truly distraught, and we're very much into the real at that period of time. And it seems to me that the punished, it's almost as if their punishment is to deal with the real in many way. Mm-hmm. And so this person whose life is ruined has like permanent turmoil, or like things that, you know, go wrong in their life, their relationships are affected, mm-hmm. and they have to deal with some serious, perhaps temporary, but very serious consequences, mm-hmm. right? And maybe that's what we feed off of. And they potentially are, at least to me, the only people who experience like the modicum of reality. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, reality is not viral. It doesn't like radiate out of them towards other people. It's just kind of contained to the individual. And, you know, once they close their Instagram and decide to just like do something else, then
yeah, I mean, I feel like it's like the classic thing that everybody says about the internet is that like you don't realize that it's like real people on the other side, or you don't really realize that it's real people you're watching. I think because partially, I mean, I think sometimes that I think if we were able to actually truly internalize like the reality of all of those people, like I think we would all like submit to collective insanity. Like I don't know how anybody could ever actually internalize that all of the people that we're seeing and engaging with, and perhaps punishing and sometimes being very cruel to, like I think it would be indescribably sad and emotional and difficult for us to contend with like all of their humanities, you know?
Yeah, because we'd have to deal with the entirety of them, of themselves and their emotions. And one of the things that Foucault talks about is how the cell not only makes it easier for us to be surveilled, but also separates us from the other. Mm-hmm. And so we can hear them, we can sort of see maybe their shadows or whatever, but we never consider them as being an individual because they're not in our little box, right, from which we're separated. Mm-hmm. And I think it's similar when we're just scrolling through. These are accounts. These are potentially followers, or at best they're mutuals, but they can potentially never take the form of the real. Or my own theory, right, is that until there's like touch, until there's like a physical interaction, it's very hard to see them as a whole. But mm-hmm. yeah.
Yeah, and I think obviously it's also very like reminiscent of capitalist realism in a lot of ways. Like, you know, like the line like anti-capitalism is not the opposite of capitalism anymore. Where like, you know, like anti-capitalism or anti-capitalist rhetoric has been so completely absorbed into like the capitalist machine. Like, you know, like people go and they watch the Hunger Games movie or something, which I think gives a lot of people this feeling of revolution, or you feel this like little tingle in your stomach about where you recognize, you know, parts of yourself or your experience in this movie. Like you recognize that you also live in an oppressive society, and you recognize that there's something beautiful and powerful about resisting this oppressive society. But
and you know, you're watching this piece of media that is arguably anti-capitalist or has a lot of very anti-capitalist elements, but it's also a billion-dollar capitalist enterprise, and the fact that you feel that catharsis, or the fact that you feel that engagement with the media, that like anti-capitalist solidarity with the media, is precisely what is generating profit for it under capitalism. And I think the same thing has really happened to feminism, especially on social media platforms, in media in general. Like, I think feminism is not the opposite of anti-feminism or of patriarchy anymore. I think feminism has been extremely effectively co-opted into patriarchal interests.
Yeah, and I think there's a wonderful talk called when is fantasy too much fantasy, that has this concept of the paracosm, which are these like worlds we inhabit. And I think this reminds me also, like, Marvel movies are like the most popular movies out there. I think because they present us with this idea of order, of good people losing one movie for sure, but then the next movie they come back and they win. And we see this sort of justice being played out in a world that can feel highly unjust. And the only spaces in which we do get to balance our understanding, right? We all have this understanding, well, not all, but we have potentially this understanding that the world should be just and fair and the good people should win. And I mean, we don't see it realized in the real world, but when we do consume that media, we see that realization and we're able to say, get that closure and then move on. And then we go back to a world where those two ideas are disjuncted. One thing that I'm quite worried about, and thankfully in both these situations, I think the individuals went on and lived their lives, right? And Bebe's idea of necropolitics is even more severe, right? Because not only who can be surveilled or not surveilled, is who can live, right? Which is like the next level of surveillance. And I think it's easy to see a world where, especially with teenagers, you know, people who are prone to you know, more sensitive or more prone to extreme behaviors, this kinds of things have extremely deleterious behaviors. And if we do believe that, you know, social media bullying can cause depression and anxiety all the way to suicide, I think the necropolitics is like the next level of the effectuation of biopower, which is troublesome when we think about how we're dealing with it. Even if, right now it's you lose your job and we're kind of like, we're very careless and reckless about how we do that. Once people have serious, you know, life-ending consequences, things can get quite severe.
Yeah, and we're there, you know. I think like I've like seen stories of people who have like gotten like canceled for some reason or another, like never even anything really serious, and like have killed themselves. That's something that happened last year, where like this like teenage boy, I think, was like sort of targeted. This is like so stupid, like it's like so online, but a teenage boy like influencer was like targeted by a Disney mom, like a mom who made like Disneyland content. And this teenage boy had like made a video making fun of her in some way. And she like, I think, sent her followers after him in such a violent way that he like got his scholarship for university rescinded, and he like was banned from several platforms and like even more severe things. And it was just like months of this harassment that didn't stop, and he killed himself. And obviously it's hard to ever pinpoint one specific thing, but like this is something that does happen in a very like severe and shocking way, I think.
Where do we get why do we feel, and I'll try to end on this, why do we feel this need to punish? What's your genealogy of punishment?
Well, I mean, there's a lot there. I think I think I think it often has a lot to do with a struggle for power. Like, I think that we are taught that punishment is power, like as subjects that are punished frequently. I think it can be a similar thing to like how the prisoner wishes that he were in the tower. I think part of it is just maybe this self-replicating cycle. We see punishment, ritualistic punishment, as the way that power is exerted over powerless, and we long to be powerful, and so maybe we punish. I think that it's a way of, it feels like a way of establishing social order. Like, I think it can feel like a way of like making society make sense. Again, in a way that I'm not sure. I'm sure there have been many arguments about whether this is like something that's innate somehow or whether it's just replicated socially. What do you think?
I mean, the Hobbesian view would be that we, prior to law, were in a state of constant conflict, of power against power, and punishment was just one of the ways in which this struggle was enacted. And to Hobbes, we need this Leviathan, this like don't know how to say it in English, but this gigantic structure, which is the state, to come and impose laws, and there'll still be a little bit of punishment, but it'll be following this idea of lawful punishment. So that to me seems like a sound hypothesis. I think it maybe naturalizes a little bit too much this idea of violence. We talked about this last class, I think, of the danger of seeing certain things, I think, with the cyborg as like natural or not natural. And I don't know necessarily that the primitive man would have punished, right? For sure, in Genesis, Cain and Abel, we have this idea of vengeance that's very prominent in Western thought, but I'd have to look at like other foundational texts to see if it's also being represented in the same way, and if, in like the Epic of Gilgamesh, there's also like a vengeance story or something. It makes, of course, very rational sense to us as like yeah, and he killed this person, so I'll kill that person. That's the punishment. An eye for an eye type of thing. But I wonder if this is just habituation, or if there's like a way outside of this. Because as you said, you effectuate power through this ritualistic punishment. And I think that in some ways, the promise of a feminist panopticon would be that there'd be like a loop out of it.
Yeah.
You'd be able to escape. And I think, do you mention specifically restorative justice or sort of these methods in the essay, or?
No, oh, I do, yeah. It's like, I don't really get into it, but, I think obviously the only path that makes sense to me is a feminism that believes in restorative justice, and that believes, like for somebody like Caleb, like I say in the essay, like, I think his behavior is inarguably wrong in many ways, or harmful or misogynistic. And I think that in an ideal world, he would ideally go through some kind of accountability process, and where he would receive, like some kind of consequence, perhaps to his interpersonal relationships for the things that he's done theoretically. But hopefully that, like, I think if we live our lives believing that like every 24-year-old guy who's casually misogynistic is like a total lost cause, then the feminist project might be kind of useless a little bit. Like, I think we have to believe that we can engage in some kind of restorative process in order to hold out the hope of having positive heterosexual relations, or having anti-patriarchal heterosexual relations. So I do personally believe very strongly in sort of like transformative justice and interpersonal abolition. And I think that is like the only way out of the feminist panopticon, personally.
The thing that I find very interesting is that to me it sounds very Christian. It sounds very much like people need to be contrite, and then they're solved of their sins. But in the same way, the idea of punishment also feels very Christian. So both, I think, are possible within Western thought, but I think we've picked definitely the idea of punishment from that religion, when we could have maybe picked the whole Jesus forgiveness of the sins part.
Yeah, that part was kind of cool. There was some good stuff in there.
Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you coming.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was so fun. Such a good talk.